Hey you, I'm Brandy, the Quilter on Fire. Today I'm going to show you how to bind a quilt by machine. It's quick and easy and you asked for it in the comments. But first things first, let's trim and square our quilt. Let's go! So you can see I have a quilt here that is all quilted. It's got an edge-to-edge design. So first things first, we have to square it up. So I'm going to be removing the excess batting and backing. So when I line up my ruler, I use the biggest square ruler that I have, and I take a look at the lines on the quilt. I'm talking about the seam lines where I've quilted it. And I make sure that those are lined up with the ruler so that it's nice and square. And then you simply cut. So let's take a look at this once the cutting is done. We'll remove that batting and backing and we'll have our finished quilt. So there you have it, ready to add your binding. Another tip beyond matching up the inner seams with the outer edge of the quilt to make sure your quilt is square is to fold all four corners together to make sure they're square against each other. I'm going to just show you the basics of how it works with this little scrap. Your binding will be a long 2 1/4 or 2 1/2 inch strip. You will fold it in half, press it, line up the raw edges, and stitch along the edge a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once that seam allowance is there, you'll fold it over once and twice, and you will be doing your hand stitching on the back. And that's how the binding is basically put together. Measure the perimeter of your quilt so you know how much binding you need, and then add about 20 inches to that. Here's how to join the strips together so that you have a long piece of binding. You cross them in this way, right sides together, and you want to make sure that you're sewing this from left to right. If you sew it the wrong way, you'll be able to see when you fold it over that it's not working. So left to right, then when you fold it over, it will make one long strip. We're sewing on the bias so that we reduce bulk on the binding of our quilt. When I have a thinner quilt, I use a 2 1/4 inch strip, and when I have a thicker quilt, I use a 2 1/2 inch strip. Now you fold your strip in half and press it, and you do this for the entire length of your strip, making sure that your seam allowances on those bias joins are on the inside and they're pressed to one side. I don't press those seam allowances open because I like them to be stronger, and they're stronger when they're pressed to one side. Now here's how we are going to join them together. Now ignore this machine because I'm not at home and I am a Bernina girl through and through. So we lay out our pieces right sides together, always perpendicular. And like I said, sewing left to right, but then you give it this little turn. So you're sewing top to bottom now. So you just watch. You look directly straight down the line, sewing from one corner to the other. You should not have to draw a line here. It's a straight line corner to corner. And let's take it off and see how I did. You open it up to see if the bottom raw edge and the top raw edges line up, and it looks perfect. Once you know that you've sewn it in the right direction and it's making one large strip, you fold it back and you can trim away the excess. Then you'll be folding it wrong sides together to press the entire length of your binding to then stitch on the front of your quilt. Leave about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you'll have these little triangles at the edge. You can trim those off as well. Now this is where I said I stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then when I fold it over, I press it with the seam to one side. I've placed my binding on my quilt raw edges together with about a 10-inch tail at the top. I'm about 10 to 12 inches away from the corner as well. Ideally, you want to make sure that your bias seam in your binding does not line up with the corner of your quilt because that will cause too much bulk in the fold. I'll stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance right up to the corner, leaving a 1/4 inch and then back stitching a few stitches. Right now I've got my little 1/4 inch left at the bottom here, and I'm folding to the right and then folding back over to the left, leaving the straight fold on the edge. Then you turn, you sew right from the back onto the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and continue on. You can control how your binding looks on the front and back of your quilt if you want it the same size on both sides, for instance, by changing the width of your seam allowance. You can have a little bit bigger seam allowance or smaller. You can also change the width of your binding by going as low as 2 1/4 inches or as big as 2 1/2 inches. It just really, the key here is to make sure that it's consistent all the way around your quilt. Now that I have stitched my binding all the way around the quilt, I have left about a 10 to 12 inch space unstitched. I have long tails that are 10 or 12 inches on each side, and I'm using this old school method. This is the way I have done it forever. There are so many multiple ways of doing this final thing, but I think that this one is really fun. So I am holding the edges of the binding together so that they're taut on the quilt, and then I put in a needle, or pin actually, then I put in a pin at a 1/4 inch in, and I just do it by eye. I put the pin in a 1/4 inch, and once I have that in, I fold my quilt in half and pull the binding away. You can see where there's that 12-inch space, and I turn these so that they're lined up right sides together. You can see that where the fold is, so you know if you're doing it right sides together. I lay it down flat on my machine. I put them perpendicular using that pin to make sure that they're lined up with that 1/4 inch in the right spot. And when you sew these together, you will be so surprised that they are absolutely perfectly aligned. So right now I'm still using the same pinhole to make sure that it's lined up at a 1/4 inch. I pin it down now that I have them perpendicular, and then I'm going to do that same thing where I'm sewing them right sides together from top to bottom. So I'm going to get that top corner underneath my needle, sew top to bottom, and you'll be so delighted when you see how this works out. So let's take the stitches top to bottom, just going by eye. Be sure to pull your pin before you get to it so that you don't sew over your pin. And when I'm done here, you'll see that it pulls together perfectly, and it lines up nice and straight, and it's taut on the quilt. Once you realize that you have it in the right direction, you've sewn the right corner to corner, you can go ahead and trim away the excess, just like we did before. Trim away the threads, line it all up on the quilt again, lay it out nice and flat. Great idea to press that. And then you can sew your 1/4 inch seam allowance to finish it off. I don't even need to pin here because I have it nice and taut. It's better to actually have this last seam in your binding a little too tight than a little bit too loose. When it's baggy, it gets kind of lumpy, but I'm just stitching all the way along to finish it off. You can see I'm using my finger to push the seam allowance all in the same direction, so the top one is pushed up and the bottom one is pushed up, and then I just join them together. I do a slight little back stitch here to finish it off. And there you have it, it's on the quilt. Here's how I fold over the binding that is attached to my quilt to secure it so that I'm ready to do the hand stitch on the back. You can see the fold on the corner. I just pull it all over, tuck everything inside, fold it over, and then I secure it with wonder clips or any kind of clips that you have. I make sure I have a nice mitered corner there, and then we start to stitch. I use 50 weight Sensigreen or Katona by Madeira threads in a coordinating color. You can use any kind of hair clips or wonder clips to keep your binding secure while you stitch. Now I remove one clip to get started, and I start my stitching within the seam allowance to hide the knot underneath. Then from the bottom up, I take my needle and I go through the folded edge. And I hold it with my hands so that my binding feels nice and full. The batting inside goes right to the edge fold in my binding. Once my knot is secure within my binding, I just keep on stitching. So I'm catching the bottom of the quilt without going through the quilt, and I'm coming up through the folded edge very, very close to the edge. You can get right on that edge to try to hide your stitches completely, but you're going underneath, through the quilt, and through the folded edge, but you are not going through the quilt all the way to the other side. You're only catching the backing and the batting. Every once in a while you want to check to make sure that you're not stitching through the entire quilt. Now let's tackle the corner. I love to stitch down this bias edge to keep it nice and secure. So I make sure that my fold is nice and clean, and this little corner of the edge is lining up perfectly. You can use your needle to tuck it a little bit to the side. You want to make sure that your corner is straight and square. You're going right through that little inner corner, and then you can tack it down a few times with a few hidden stitches. We're using the exact same stitch we've used on the rest of the binding, but you can see that it's opposite because the fold is opposite. So you just continue on until you have that little mitered corner stitched down. Once you're at the corner, you can stick your needle back through the corner and get back to a position where you want to be able to start stitching on your binding again. So you can see how I'm going through. You don't want to pull this too tight to collapse your corner, but you want to start stitching again and continue on. We'll just speed it up a little bit here. I can't actually sew this fast, but I want to get to where I'm going to tie a knot so I can show you how I do that. So when I get to the knot, I go in and out on almost the same spot, and then I take my needle through the loop so that I have the knot there. I try to tuck that knot under, and I go in at the same spot again and through the quilt into the batting and up about an inch without going through the back. You can't see where I turned it over, but without going through the back, and then you have it hidden in your batting, and you can take a little snip and cut off the tail. And there you have a nice and square, perfectly finished little binding. Thanks for joining me to learn how to make a quick and easy quilt binding by machine. Remember, there are all kinds of ways to bind your quilt, so you're not wrong if you do it differently. Thanks for watching the all-new Quilter on Fire YouTube channel. And if you found some good value in this video, click on that thumbs up and share it with your friends. I'll see you next week.